It says live.
All right.
There's a ticking clock.
Is it's clocking down private chat? There it is. But that's not. All right. So if I go to live. See on my phone.
So you said we can't touch arms, but I guess that's okay if artistically in the background they're touching arms.
Yeah, I mean, see if I go to live. No views. Oh, so this is private. And then I go to settings. So we're currently private. Present. No, I saw this when I was doing that. I was editing this earlier. Here it is. Privacy is public. Save. Now we should be, because I see it on my end.
Let me. Hey, we are live, apparently.
You are? You see me on, does my channel show it?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. One watching.
Okay, let me turn that off so there's not a really bad feedback there. Okay, you're on YouTube, so.
All right. So, I guess I'll do the real quick intro. Reviewer 311, former Marine infantryman, Revolutionary War reenactor, amateur history enthusiast, and we got somebody here. This is my first attempt at a live stream, and Chris Kimball, say your name correctly there, Mr. Kimball.
That's right, Chris Kimball. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Chris Kimball from Seminole War is going to be joining me on my first live stream to talk about the Seminole Wars. And yeah, very excited about this and have an expert in this era to talk about a fascinating piece of American history. So welcome to the live stream. Thanks for all of those that are jumping in right now, Henry and Gusto Gums. And we'll just, Chris, if you want to take it from here, tell us about yourself. And let's talk about the Seminole Wars.
I'm in Tallahassee right now, and I actually work in the State Archive building. So researching's kind of my passion. I started doing reenactments, historical interpretation in 1985. So 40 years doing this. Throughout these years, I thoroughly researched the Seminole Wars. And along the way, we'll talk about anything anyone wants to talk about. If we want to talk about muskets and black powder and arms, we can do that too. I was with the state park system in Florida for 10 years. And while I was there, we developed a black powder safety program, which I was part of putting together, pretty much based off the National Park Safety Program, except in the state parks, you can actually have reenactments on state park property there. So the only big difference from the national parks. So anyway, I am compassionate about researching. I started researching the Seminole War when I did the historical interpretation. I also delved into other areas of history. I worked at Fort Morgan, Alabama for 2.5 years, and that's my mug here with Daniel Morgan on. Y'all know him. And so anyway, when I was doing the reenactments historical interpretation, it's an area of history not too many people knew about, and not much was written at the time. So first thing I did, I wanted to compile a list of battles and events. So it eventually became a book, Seminole and Creek War Battles and Events, listing over 300 different battles of the First, Second, and Third Seminole War. I run from the War of 1812 up through 1858, so antebellum period. And while I was researching that, I found out about certain battles nobody ever written about. So I wanted to write about that, but I need to build my bibliography. I just didn't have enough information at the time. So it eventually became my book, Alachua Ambush, in 2019. And one thing, I had to find information about the people involved in the battles. And so that took me to a lot of places, like the location, what was the Newport Barracks in Kentucky, south of Cincinnati, and cemetery in Cincinnati where Mrs. Elizabeth Montgomery was buried, who was killed by Seminole Indians in 1840, things like that. But to build my bibliography, I went through the Army-Navy Chronicle, and every issue, it was a military journal of the time that went from 1835 to 1844. It was a weekly publication, about 16 pages long. There's a few months where it ceased publication when it was going bankrupt for a while, and then it came back, and then it went under for good. But I went through over 6,000 pages to find all the Seminole War reference guides. So I made a reference guide to the Seminole War because I wanted to index everything, like it has 5 different things about the Battle of Okeechobee, and I just wanted to reference it all. But going through, there's just stuff I couldn't leave out. For example, here's an 1837, March 2nd issue. There's an inquiry board with the Army that they're trying to develop a replacement for the standard arms at the time, of course, the Springfield that we know, let's say. And at the time, they're coming out with the hulls, but they wanted to do a replacement because the Springfield's basically a clone of the Charleville, that we've, of course, seen some great demonstrations on that. And, of course, it's about 100-year-old technology at this time. But the Army Board had several different manufacturers like Colt and Cochrane. Of course, we know the Colt revolving cylinder that they're working on, and the Cochrane had a round cylinder that was horizontal that would rotate around, hold 9 shots. That was another version of multi-shots. The problem is that at least one shot, there'd be one round pointed towards you. So you didn't want chamber fire there. And then according to what it says here, that there was another Baron Hackett's gun, which I could not find out what that is. But apparently when they were testing with the board, they went out to test them in Baron Hackett's gun. They find the lock was broken on. Apparently there's been sabotage there. So everything was kind of cutthroat there. Interesting thing, like we know the hulls, breech loading. If you ever go to Harper's Ferry, you'll just geek out at all the Hall's rifles in there. I took a bucket list trip a few years ago, and the 2nd Dragoons were using those at the time, and they were giving them to some of the state militias. Like they gave it to the Georgia State Militia in Southwest Georgia, Stewart County, and they hated them. They thought they broke down too easily, so they kept them for the garrison, just for on parade, and they used Jaeger rifles instead.
So they used the Hall rifles were in the Peter A. Schmidt book about the Hall rifle, he mentions they go down to Florida, and
yes,
like what you said, the Hall has problems in Florida.
Right.
What did you, in your research, have you kind of ran into, like, what is the experience of the Hall in Florida, and why is it? Because it's paper. It's not paper cartridges though, right?
Well, it has a breech block that comes up, and then you stuff the cartridge in and put it down. Sometimes some powder would tend to get between that breech block. And so if you'd have it build up too much, it might tend to explode, and which would be hazardous. And so the soldiers hated it. They eventually fixed the problem, but the reputation of the hulls by that point was garbage. So that was it for the hulls.
What was the well, I mean, I can easily derail this whole conversation to talk about muskets in Florida. Florida, stupid hot and humid. Had the privilege of living in Jacksonville for a while.
Yeah.
And how did flintlocks and muskets handle in Florida from what you've read? Or I guess just if you want to expand on that and kind of take it where you go.
Surprisingly, I don't hear too much. I guess everybody was used to having no air condition back then. But I mean, when I worked at Fort Morgan, I'd take my Charlieville and pretend Springfield in the casemate, and I'd sit there, and with the humidity, you could actually watch it rust right in front of you. It's miserable doing that. So, there was a problem. Of course, they also mentioned about constant water as a problem. Even the dragoons riding through, sometimes up to the girdles of their horses, or deeper, they're just getting everything wet, getting the reports wet for the adjutant. So, you can kind of look, if you look on the microfilm, and if it's real dark paper and the ink is hard to read, it's real light, that means it's gotten wet. And they tried to dry it out, but it's been in Florida if it's deteriorating.
So I think it would just be beneficial because all I know is that there are Seminole Wars. There's multiple ones. Florida State says they never surrendered or something.
Yeah.
The Seminole Wars, are the Seminoles one Native American tribe that's a constant tribe that's fighting from the first one? When is the first Seminole War? And if you could just do a general overview of the Seminole Wars, actually.
Yeah, the first Seminole War was kind of an aftermath of the War of 1812. There, the British were using the Creeks as mercenaries. And in fact, some of the Seminole chiefs came with the British to the Battle of New Orleans and were not deployed in the field, but they were in the ships just watching. And after that, the Americans were trying to capture Florida. There's what we call the Patriot War, which was around St. Augustine and Palatka, the St. Johns River. The United States wanted to capture Florida, and before we had the Monroe Doctrine totally written out, and they failed at that. But Americans under I think Matthews in Georgia went down and told the Seminoles don't get involved, and the Seminoles were kind of indignant that they're being told by a party that's not even supposed to be there on what to do. So there was I guess a filibuster is what you might call them, came down the St. Johns River and were kind of putting St. Augustine to siege and all that. And there's a company of Marines escorting the wagons, and some of the Seminoles and their black former slave allies attacked the Marines in the 12-mile swamp outside St. Augustine and beat them pretty bad. So the Georgia militia and some of the regulars went chasing after him to King Painstown near Gainesville in the Alachua Prairie. Well, they're going down one road, and King Payne, Seminole chief, and his warriors are heading towards St. Augustine, coming down the other road. So they have a immediate skirmish and ends up in like a week-long siege. Georgia soldiers build a breastwork and are under siege until just one night they sneak out and run back up the St. Johns. So the United States was kind of against the Seminoles after that and wanted to remove them. War of 1812 ends, and Andrew Jackson came down into Florida during the War of 1812. And after that, he came down a second time in 1817. The escaped slaves, or the former black Royal Marines that the British had trained, had built a fort on Prospect Bluff on the Apalachicola River, and were kind of maintaining I guess what you could say, a blockade on the river, which is kind of bad because Apalachicola splits off into the Chattahoochee and the Flint River in Georgia. And that's where your cotton's coming down to go to market in New Orleans. So that's your economic factor if you want that. So Jackson told some of his troops and sailors, Navy sailors in New Orleans to go up and supply Fort Scott at the Georgia-Spanish-Florida border. And if that fort fires on you, just fire back him and hopefully destroy it. Well, that happened. The ship came up with supplies for Fort Scott. The fort fired on the ship, which was a 42-foot-long gunboat with, I guess, carronades on it and a big, either a 24-pounder or a 32-pounder in front, fired a hot shot at the fort and hit the powder magazine and blew the whole thing up there and destroyed it. One of the worst pre-Civil War explosive actions. And so then Andrew Jackson came down Florida to punish the Seminoles and really to try to force the Spanish to decide to give it up to the United States. And that led Jackson's rampaging through Florida, capturing Pensacola, going back to the United States and said, look what I fixed for you. And of course, Congress was shocked. But really, I think they are just relieved because they didn't do anything more than a slap on the wrist. And John C. Calhoun, the Secretary of War, kind of had suggested that Jackson do it in the first place anyway. So that convinced the Spanish to sell Florida in the Adam Onis Treaty in 1819, ratified in 1821, changing over the flags. Now Florida is U.S. territory. Have all this territory that they want people settling in. Problem is that there's all these Indians, Seminoles, Miccosukes. They weren't really organized too much as one tribe until the 20th century. So, but there's different bands. And another thing is that escaped slaves would run to the Seminoles as a underground railroad to get away from the United States. They run to Spanish Florida, or if they could run north and get into Canada. So it was a part of the Underground Railroad. So United States did not want that as an incentive for the southern plantation owners to lose their slaves and cause trouble. Another economic factor was cattle. You had a lot of Spanish cattle roaming around, and the Seminoles captured that and became a very large cattle cattle barons, I guess you could say. And so you had all this free range cattle. The settlers were moving down. They were finding these cattle wandering around, and they take them as part of their livestock. Nobody fences them in at the time. And the Seminoles would retaliate and go capture them back. So everybody would complain about everyone attacking each other. That led to the Treaty of Moultrie Creek in 1823. Now, this is before Andrew Jackson was president, but they're already talking about Indian removal to west of the Mississippi. So they said, well, we can't remove them yet, but if we concentrate them in this area and all that and put them in an area where they can be happy and not attack the settlers. Of course, that didn't work. And eventually, the problem was, one thing was, there was, we talk about climate change. Well, that can be caused by a volcano, as in Napoleon and Waterloo. They have the summer or the year without summer, as they call. A volcano exploded and cooled down the atmosphere for a few years, caused snow in the summertime, caused mass famine worldwide. Same thing in the 1820s, still going on there. The Seminoles were told to move down south in Central Florida, and raise their own crops. The crops failed, not only for them, but for all the settlers. So it's a free-for-all, raiding each other. So the United States decided to try to remove the Florida Indians. And so then it pressures them, said, okay, you guys think you like South Florida? We got a place where you'll like it even better. There's no white people around. They didn't call it Oklahoma then, they called it Arkansas. It became Oklahoma later on. Indian territory, some of the Creeks and Choctaw and a few of the Cherokees, they've been moving over there. So you know what? You join them. So the United States was pressuring it. You had one faction of the tribe that was very eager to be done with all that fighting. Another part of the tribe says, yeah, we're not going to leave at all. We've been moved around too much. So they developed a resistance, and kind of it was a mutual uprising in the late 1835. Some of the plantation owners were attacked by some of the Seminoles, raiding them, taking off their slaves. At the same time, the Army was sending up a column to reinforce Fort King they had built in the center of the state. Fort King's recently been rebuilt, so it's a historical site in Ocala, Florida. A column of 110 soldiers marching from Fort Brooke, Tampa Bay, up to Fort King. The Seminoles ambushed them and killed all but four of the group with the command. Major
Dade. All
but
four, you said?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Wow.
So 99 were soldiers, and 8 officers were kind of killed on the spot. Third largest defeat of American forces by Native Americans in the history of the United States Army. Of course, the second largest was Custer's defeat, and the first largest defeat of Native Americans defeating U.S. forces was St. Clair in 1790.
1792, 1793.
Yeah.
Battle of the Wabash. Great song, by the way.
Yeah, which
I was just saying 99 men. That's I was going to wonder, that's got to be up there, because Custer's is what, 270. Wabash is like 800 men. So 100. That's a lot of men to lose, especially in an Indian war.
And the Battle of Wabash, that wiped out 25% of the Army. Wow. The Army was kind of small back then. Dade's command of the Seminole War, it started out, the Army was like 8,000 man strong as size of the Army, 8 infantry regiments, 4 artillery regiments, 1 dragoon regiment. They added the 2nd Dragoon Regiment when the war started. It got up to about 10,000 soldiers, training ground for the Mexican War and the Civil War. And for the regular Army, there's, in the Second Seminole War, 1,466 were buried in Florida, or most of them buried, some buried outside there, especially if you're officer's family and have money to ship them out. And most buried in a mass grave in St. Augustine. But of those 1,466, 328 are battle related. So you got a majority of those, died from disease. Of those battle related fatalities, 1/3 was Dade's command. When you look at the muskets of the day and all that, they're not that made for accuracy. You just get a volley of men firing off. It's a giant shotgun effect, and you'll hit something. So there's one account of battle line a mile and a half long through the swamp, and maybe 5 soldiers get injured or killed, 5 casualties. Yes, they weren't that great a shot, but the arms and the confusion and the conditions they're fighting in.
Were the Seminoles and the Native Americans in Florida, was it primarily they're armed with muskets, trade guns, flintlocks, or were they still using bows, arrows, or was it a mix? Do we know the composition of what they were armed with?
Good question. Uh, they started out with muskets because they were trading with the British. Before then, in the Treaty of Payne's Landing that the United States made to remove the Seminoles in 1832, as gifts in the treaty, the United States gave the Seminoles 2,200 Derringer rifles.
Oh, rifles. Really?
Yes,
Oh,
Derringer.
no.
And how is it that we always arm the side that we're about to fight in wars?
Yeah.
How often is that repeated?
What
Uh,
what year is that you said? 20
that that
1822?
that was 1832.
Okay.
Derringer had a contract to provide rifles for the Indian Bureau as gifts with the treaties from, I think, starting about 1816 or 1818 and went to 1840. Derringer rifle, it looks like a kind of a smaller caliber, similar to Springfield, but of course, being rifles, and they first started out as flintlock. And of course, the Indian agent, he said, well, we want to give them percussion, so they have to rely on the United States to get percussion caps, because Florida has a lot of chert and limestone, which is where you can get flint from and actually make musket flints. After when the war first started, one of the first large campaigns, General Edmund Gaines brought a large number of like 2,500 regulars and mainly Louisiana militia from New Orleans to make a big strike back at the Seminoles. So this was like 2 months later. Comes to Florida, comes into Tampa Bay, marches up that same road, buries Major Dade's men 8 weeks after they're killed, because
Oh, wow.
the men had pretty much were still lying where they had fallen there. And pretty grisly sight. They buried them in a mass grave there. And so then, as they're heading a few miles north to cross the Withlacoochee River, the Seminoles ambushed them. And in fact, there's one of the officers killed. His name was, I think it was James Izzard. He had one of the Hall rifles, and he got shot in the head and dropped it in the river. And actually, somebody recovered that back in the 70s.
Wow. Really?
Yeah.
I've never heard this.
And because he is a dragoon officer, and there wasn't very many Hall rifles in that particular spot, and somebody actually found that. And the Seminole War Foundation, we now took charge of kind of the collection of artifacts, at least helping hold it or curate it. And that's one of the things in the collection there. I think it was a model 1833 carbine. I think you're right on that, Mike. Anyway, the Army under Gaines, they penned up and they made like a pentagram-shaped breastwork around them, their encampment. I think I'm thinking like 250 feet wide or something. I don't know. It had to be. I don't know if that was right, but they excavated it back in '95, and I went out there and visited with the crew excavating it. The archaeologists called my friend Earl in Ocala, said, I can't find that. I'm not sure if they really have battle here. And he said, go over here. And we actually found where that breastwork was, just a slight rise above the ground, and followed around through the palmettos to kind of spot out by eye who it was. So Gary Ellis, he got the archaeologist, he got some metal detectors out there, and they started looking for the shot patterns where the soldiers would fire at the Indians and the Indians would fire at the soldiers. With Louisiana militia, you had everything under the sun. You had a lot of buckshot and birdshot, even a 75 caliber ball. They found one with them. interesting enough, for the Indians, it was pretty consistent, 35 to 45 caliber. So you would think the Army would be more standard and the Indians would be anything under the, but it was actually the other way around there. So from the shot pattern, it really changed a lot of what we're thinking about the history.
So they were bringing out-of-state militia to supplement the army to go on, because when the army would fight the Indians up throughout most of the history, if I recall correctly, they go for their settlements, right? They try to chase them back to the settlements and destroy the settlement. I know they do that up in New York and the American Revolution. Are they not able to take that strategy down to Florida as easily? Or they bring in, like what St. Clair does, right? He brings in militia to supplement the army to go up into the Ohio, and that doesn't work. Is that they're still trying to do that in Florida?
Well, the Seminoles had kind of learned from the Creek War a few years before, during the War of 1812, when Jackson would attack one of the towns and wipe out the whole town, like Otto-C or Holytown was, I think, Georgia militia who attacked that. And of course, Horseshoe Bend, Jackson wiped out the Creek Confederacy on that and killed about 800 people, wiping it out. Horseshoe Bend National Park in the kind of central East Alabama. So the Seminoles kind of took note of what was going on and would not concentrate their population in areas more. Now, when Jackson first came down, he attacked Miccosukee Town, which is now near Tallahassee, and there was probably 3,000 people living in that area in the surrounding. And I was talking with Bill Steele, the archaeologist, actually went out there a couple months ago, and it was a conglomeration of several different towns, everybody trying to get away from the United States, coming down Spanish Florida. And 3,000 people was more than the population of St. Augustine and Pensacola combined.
Wow.
So they kind of learned to split themselves up after that. We don't really find that big a town. I mean, they mention a town that could have held 200 people or something like that is the biggest, but they start splitting up into like several families. And so it starts splitting up like that. Interesting is that the archaeological dig at Miccosukee Town, they recently had to shut it down because of NAGPRA issues. They found a burial there. It's apparently a significant burial because the archaeologists who I was going out there and visiting had worked with the Miccosukee tribe and the Seminole tribe, and kind of knew that they had found a burial of significance. And I think he kind of knew he was getting into burial when he finds a brass kettle that's, killed, crushed. Then he finds a musket with the barrel bent. And then he finds some teeth and realizes that's a burial. And so once that happens, you have to shut it down and bring the tribe in and do what they can for the, Native American Graves Act. Interesting enough, there's another Battle of Wahoo Swamp, which is 8 miles away from Dade's battleground. They were doing an archaeology dig out there, and they found a brass trigger guard there. And this is all former mud, the soldiers and Seminoles fighting in the mud. One of the soldiers, actually, he was a Marine, Andrews, I think. He was formerly with the U.S. Army, was at the Battle of New Orleans, and he quit the Army and joined the Marines, and he was killed at the Battle of Wahoo Swamp. He is the first Marine officer that had been killed in 23 years in combat.
Wow.
Of wounds from combat. He actually died a few days later from injuries. But the brass trigger guard, they found, the archaeologists started, contacting Springfield and all that and said, "Where's this from?" And Springfield says, "We never made brass trigger guards."
Yeah.
So I determined that it came from a British musket. So that would have been the Indians there.
So a Peter A. Schmidt book, Muskets, the early years, he mentions in that book that the Marine Corps in the early 19th century, so 1800s around, they specifically ask the Navy to provide them with brass fittings, muskets with brass fittings, which are brown bess style. So it'd be the third pattern of the land musket, because brass is better at sea.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if that's what that could be, because that would make sense, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're out at sea for a
Yeah.
long time, you want to lose your muskets to degradation and stuff. But that's fascinating.
See, what the Marines were doing there is the Army recruited a regiment of Creek Indians to fight against their cousins, the Seminoles, and the commanding officers were Marines. There, the Navy and Marines were kind of head of the Indian regiment, and except that one of the officers who had volunteered for that, Lane, I think he had died from fever going up there, and he was with the First Dragoons there. Anyway, several different rabbit holes we can go down here.
Yeah, I didn't realize the Marine Corps had such a pull into the Seminole Wars. The Seminoles they're wearing black. You mentioned they're wearing black in Florida. Is that like a sort, not a uniform, but like a dress? I've looked at the dress of how the Seminoles dress, and they dress. It seems like their trousers come all the way down to their ankles. They're wearing like long sleeve, or maybe the artwork I'm looking at isn't too correctly.
Maybe I can let me see.
Present your screen.
Yeah. See
if anyone has any questions in the chat, we got up to 12 people here, so that's pretty awesome. Again, first live stream I've ever done. Mr. Kimball is a historian on the Seminole Wars. He also has a YouTube channel, Seminole War. And if you go in the description, there's links to the books that he's written. So yeah, this is the guy to ask if you have any questions about the Seminole Wars or Southeast America and that sort of history. I feel like it's very much underappreciated and under talked about time frame, especially from War of 1812. I mean, the next one is the Mexican-American War, but really it's the Civil War, right? It's Battle of New Orleans, Civil War. Everything else that happens in the middle is, the war, the War of Post. So.
Yeah. Well, one thing leads to another. The 7 Years' War, the American Revolution. Then you go out some military action in Ohio, the Wabash, War of 1812. Creek War
keeps on flowing in.
Everything just leads to another. First Seminole War was a kind of unfinished business from the Creek War and the War of 1812.
Had the Seminoles been, well, because Florida had belonged to what, the Spanish, and then at the end of the 7 Years' War, it goes to the British. It's one of the colonies that doesn't join the other 13 to rebel. Florida doesn't. And then it goes back to the Spanish. So the Seminoles are probably not having too much impact from the European powers coming out of their bases. It's mostly out St. Augustine and Pensacola.
Yeah.
So are they left alone, trading back and forth?
Yes, exactly. And, pretty much left alone. The British got Florida, trading with the Spanish after the 7 Years' War. And then, of course, when the Spanish helped the Americans in the Revolution, part of the treaty, the Spanish got it back. I found one reference. The Seminoles weren't too keen on the Spanish,
really?
Because there was a time when the Spanish were a bit ruthless on the native population. So there's a reference I found that the Seminoles found that the English were giving Florida back to the Spanish, so they started raiding the English plantations on the fringes of St. Augustine in retaliation because they're mad the Spanish are coming back in town there.
Well, here's our Revolutionary War facts. The United States invades Florida twice and is beaten back both times, or both invasions fail to take St. Augustine. Imagine, and I think one of those battles is like in June. June of
Yeah.
1770. Like,
Yeah.
if you ever been down to Jacksonville, Florida in June, it's a time you should be spent in a pool, not
Yeah.
trying to march on St. Augustine.
Yeah. If you go, was it Fort Frederica and learn about the Battle of Bloody Marsh and all that, the conflict between the British and the Spanish. But East and West Florida was the 14th and 15th colony. That's where a lot of the Tories ran to get away from the rebels there. Rebels as in America, it's not the later rebels as in the South. Yeah. So, yeah. Um, and another thing about the 1830s, it's experimental time, testing of arms, as we mentioned, the Hall. So, yeah, so on answering Mike, Andrew Jackson came down to Florida in 1817, the first Seminole War, but he pretty much had the blessing of John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War. Calhoun said, go beat back the Indians, go into Florida, invade them if you have to. He said, don't bother the Spanish. And of course, Jackson went and took over this remote Spanish fort at St. Mark's on the St. Mark's River, and then took Pensacola, because he said the Spanish were aiding and abetting the enemy there. And of course, it was something that was everybody was quietly talking about there. And anyway, and it led to the treaty that ceded Florida to the Spanish. But yeah, this was a time that they were experimenting with arms. They're and I'm putting on my next YouTube channel about the Seminoles are hearing from the Spanish fishermen on the coast that they're beating the Americans in Mexico, which is not happening. The Americans are just massacring the Mexican army. It's mainly because of the artillery. Converting to percussion gap, but the testing out the arms, looking on the expenditure records, and I was doing research going into the New American State Papers, the expenditure. I can't remember if this was the military fairs or if this was like in the expenditures of the budget. It had the military budget of what had been spent in the second Seminole War from 1835 to 1840. What was interesting, looking at the number of cartridges that they expended, which they list, and I can't remember how many tens of thousands of that was, but I figured out that they used about one musket flint would fire about 20 cartridges. And I kind of found that out for myself. Is true. In the reenactments, musket flint, that's about how long it will last for me. And then of course I also learned that in the 1830s, 1/3 of the shot fired were percussion cap, which totally took me by surprise. There, that was that widespread at that point.
And that would mostly be, correct me if I'm wrong, but Peter A. Schmidt's book about the Hall rifle, the Hall carbine, 1833. That's the first percussion cap weapon, if I recall correctly. And the dragoons have them. Yeah. And the dragoons have them. And you said the dragoons are down in Florida. Yeah. So they're getting some.
Yeah, the first Halls was flintlock, I think, in 1819, and then 1833 to the 1840s they were percussion.
Huh. I'm imagining, just like you're painting behind you, that they're using the waterways to transit around. They have forts on the waterways. There's not too much. I mean, obviously you've talked about them marching. So are they, it sounds like a lot of ambush kind of warfare, insurgency warfare, quick ambush. The Seminoles disappear. Doesn't sound like the Seminoles trying to stay around for stand-up gunfights too long. They're hitting and moving. Are they raiding the outposts as well?
Not really direct raids against forts. You have some of that, but yeah, when you're when you're stuck in that area and you have families to hide out and protect, hit and run's pretty much how you have to do. But when they killed Major Dade and his command at the beginning, um, for about 4 months, the Seminoles really shut down Florida. Excuse me. And there was nobody really going in the interior because of that. Everybody was afraid to go alone down any road. In fact, I did an article with one of my friends, Tim Lara, who collects stamps. I co-wrote an article with him about the mail express riders, and there's a lot of interesting ones like that. There was like 2 of them that were killed coming out of St. Augustine, and the Seminole chief or war leader, Wildcat, complains about, say, killed 2 of the express riders, but all he got was papers, so he really didn't get anything he wanted out of that there. The picture behind me is from what they call the Scott Massacre, and that was the emphasis that got the Army involved in the First Seminole War. It's one thing about the Native Americans attacking, Americans coming into Florida, but once they attacked a military target, that gave Andrew Jackson the permission he needed to come down in Florida pretty much and retaliate. The Army had Fort Scott at the confluence of the rivers on the southwest corner of Georgia. That was the kind of like the border between Georgia and Spanish Florida, and they are bringing boats of supplies to upriver from New Orleans and Mobile to supply the fort. And 2 of the boats coming up with 40 soldiers supposedly sick, and then some of the wives and children were attacked, ambushed one night when they're coming up, and pretty much totally wiped out. 6 of the soldiers jumped ship and made it back to Fort Scott. They were only about a mile from Fort Scott when that happened.
Oh, wow.
One of the women, she was captured by the Seminoles and held as a prisoner for several months. And then, that was November 30th, 1817. And they attacked a Seminole village on the Econfina River in April. And she was recaptured and brought back into Georgia. She is about prisoner for 4 or 5 months. Anyway, yes, ambush was kind of the thing, and really taught the Army certain tactics and different methods of fighting that they could use later on, which even led to, they even teach in the officer school today, the War College.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to talk about. Is there anything that's popped out in the research about the tactics or TTPs that they changed fighting the Seminoles? Or
yes. One thing is that the Major Dade's command was raining, so they covered their overcoats over their muskets, which became a problem when the Seminoles ambushed him and started firing, and the soldiers have to unbutton their coats.
Okay, yeah.
So it was a change of Army regulations that you can't button your musket inside your greatcoat at that point. There, that was the big change. And also Major Dade, because he felt he was safe, he brought in his flankers as advanced and side guard, so they were just one main column. So they became a real good target at that point. There's another battle I looked at that happened near Fort King 5 years later, where the Seminoles attacked an Army company outside of Fort King, and they had to fight almost hand to hand. They got surrounded and fought their way back into Fort King. It was kind of a running skirmish, but I think the success, that why they survived, even though it was like 18 men surrounded by around 100 or 200 Seminoles is they fought infantry tactics, and the captain ordered the men to fight tree to tree and just push the enemies through and fix the bayonets and charge with the bayonets, and did by the book infantry tactics. And I think that really saved their bacon from getting totally wiped out at that point. So, I believe maybe they lost 3 soldiers killed, 5 or 7 wounded. Captain Gabriel Rains was wounded, shot in the abdomen at that point.
And this was a patrol, or this was like an outpost? These guys were on an outpost?
This is an outpost, and Captain Gabriel Rains, he was known as the father of landmines, and got tired of the Seminoles attacking his soldiers doing sentry duty and all that. So he set up a booby trap out in the woods, and they were actually heard it explode one night, and they went the next day looking for the Indians, and the Indians ambushed them at that point. And they had running skirmishes, one of the more interesting battles in the war. But I find, as an example of changing tactics from, if you're just one column and one target and concentrated, good chance that you're not going to do as good or surrounded or under siege than if you go with the infantry tactics and spread out and put your flanks out there and charge with the bayonets. The Seminoles didn't care for fighting with bayonets there.
That's interesting, though. And it sounds like the regular armies down there constantly they're guarding the frontier, right? So they're there, and the militias, because you mentioned the Louisiana militia would come in. Would they just come in when called upon to help go on campaigns? Or because the first war, I guess, the first war starts, you said, and then how does the first war end? How does the second war start? How does the second war end?
Yeah.
What are the 3 wars? Yeah.
The first Seminole War was pretty much Andrew Jackson's campaign, lasted about 4 or 5 months in Florida. Jackson came down, and when he had burned Miccosukee town and burned this large Seminole town on the Swanee River, took over Pensacola, Seminoles retreated from that, and everything calmed down from that. So it ended. Jackson went up north, and Congress told Jackson, okay, if you can give Pensacola back to the Spanish, we're going to negotiate, a peace here. What's kind of interesting is that he gave Fort St. Marks, he took over. Jackson held that for like 11 months until they signed the treaty and handed Spanish Florida over back, and they gave the fort back to the Spanish.
And we weren't at war with Spain, right? We're just
we're not
going down there and taking Spanish property, just like, sorry, buddy, like, pays to be a winner. I don't know what to tell you.
What's funny is that Jackson, he took over Fort St. Marks, and he claimed all the ordnance and artillery and arms, and the Spanish said, no, those are ours. And Jackson said, no, I won it by contest or whatever, and sent the Spanish back to Pensacola. So he gave the fort back to the Spanish, but by that point the Spanish were leaving anyway. But the Americans had built a fort on the Apalachicola River, Fort Gadsden, they called it, named after James Gadsden from the Gadsden Purchase later on. It was built on the ruins of the Negro fort that they had destroyed back in 1816. And the American fort, it became the American Guantanamo starting in March 1818, and was actually the American enclave in Spanish Florida for 3 years until the flags were transferred over, when the treaty was ratified by both countries there. So that's where the flag was originally first raised in Florida. Has been there since on the Fort Gadsden. But interesting story about that is back then the soldiers, they had some recruiting areas that they'd recruit soldiers at and train them, and they pretty much send them in the field out there. There wasn't no 8-week long basic training. They just teach them about arms and marching and send them to their company. They recruit whole companies at the time. So, and they'd have major areas of recruitment like Newport, Kentucky, I mentioned. It's Fort Columbus, Fort Jay, Governor's Island in New York, Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, kind of areas that are near the big populations. And so anyway, they had recruited a company of soldiers in New York, bringing them down, bringing Spanish Florida. And I think that'd be a miserable place to be stationed with your company out in the middle of nowhere. The nearest city was at least 100 miles away up in Georgia. So what happened is that the ship was coming up the river, and the soldiers thinking, what did I get myself into? Kind of when I was going to Fort Huachuca, Arizona, picked up my truck in California, driving down I-10 and then down the road. I could see Fort Huachuca 30 miles away down the valley. So like, what did I get myself into? And so anyway, the soldiers on the ship actually commandeered the ship, took over the ship, and were sailing away to head back home. The Marines were sent after them and went and recaptured the ship, brought them back in, and hanged 2 of the ringleaders. And the rest of the soldiers were, of course, forced to do their enlistment at Fort Gadsden.
This is so the first Seminole War, you said, is 1817?
Yes, 1817.
Okay.
I mentioned,
sorry.
mentioned about the second Seminole War starting, but it kind of just ended with a whimper. Pretty much is that the Army spent the next 7 years trying to remove the natives from Florida by either capturing them or forcing them to surrender, saying if you surrender, we'll give you food and clothing and supplies, bribing them too, which one of the officers said, for what they're expending for the war, it'd just be better just to bribe the Seminoles and have them leave Florida. It'd be cheaper that way.
So you mentioned the Creek. Were the Creek down there throughout most of that time? I've never heard of this Creek auxiliary force.
Yeah, the Creek and the Seminoles are related, same culture, same language, and of course they had broken off from their own political differences, and a lot of the traditional Creeks who lost in the Creek War fled to Florida and joined the Seminoles. In
wow,
1836, they were doing the Creek removal in Georgia, Alabama, and General Thomas Jessup told the Creeks that if he'll have a regiment formed up and pay them, and they're waiting for removal, and that way they could earn a lot of money going after the Seminoles and chasing after their cousins, and that way get money that'll be more beneficial for them on the removal, which they kind of agreed to anyway at that point in 1836. So there were 750 Creek warriors recruited and were in Florida for 1 year. And
that's a lot, right? That's a lot for a Native American force.
And there's 100, I think about 110 that had died mostly from disease or something, because there was a compensation given to the survivors. And so in 1848, there was a congressional paper to provide money to the families of the survivors and identify who they were.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's one part of history that I always find really interesting is even up to like Little Bighorn, it was his native scouts that spotted the Sioux in the valley. So it's just always to see how complex the geopolitics was, because you don't really 750. That's about the size of a regular army regiment of the time. That's a lot of
Yes.
firepower in in the Americas. In Europe, it's nothing, but we have.
Yeah. Right.
But,
Yeah.
so that's the Second Seminole War. It's just that containment,
Yeah.
trying to extract them out and then
Yeah.
send them
It
over to.
Yeah, it became really they dwindled down in number. So finally in 1842, the United States was focusing more out west. There at a certain point, there's only a few hundred left in Florida, and you can kind of read the Army Navy Chronicle. At first, it was all about the Florida War, and then near the end of that time period, it's covering out west in Texas and everything that's going on in there. And the United States just doesn't want to spend any money on that. And finally, the Colonel William Worth, he says, well, it's just too much of a problem. Chasing after Indians in the Everglades where nobody wants to go anyway. Let's just leave them alone and call it a day. So they pretty much called it into the war. President John Tyler at that point gave him the go ahead to that. So they just declared the war over, and Florida became a state a few years later in 1845. And then in the 1850s, there was just one last push to remove the Seminoles. In 1842, they estimated there was 500 Seminole and Miccosukee left in Florida. And then at the Third Seminole War, it was pretty much the Florida militia that fought that. There's maybe the 5th Infantry was involved, or one of the artillery regiments involved that was garrisoning some of the posts. It was almost all in Southwest Florida at that point. And so, they realized, it just wasn't worth it because they weren't really having any effect on that. And finally that ended in 1858 because, just bigger things going on in Kansas and Missouri, why are we bothering these Indians? Nobody wants to live in this swampy area. And it just kind of died on a whimper on that. The last chief removed, Billy Bowlegs. He agreed to remove with 180 of his people in 1858. And they said that's it at that point.
Who are some William Sherman? He's down in Florida, right? He does time in
Right.
Florida. Yeah. Is that the Third Seminole War?
That's actually the Second Seminole War. He
Oh, wow.
graduated, I think, from the academy in 1841 and came down to Florida, was at Fort Pierce. I can't remember what regiment he was in, but he was escort for Chief Wildcat when the Army was trying to get Chief Wildcat to bring his people in. And so he was escorting Wildcat to, try to get his people to surrender, and Wildcat would just go from place to place and, my people are starving. I need the foods. We could use blankets. Oh, by the way, I need some horses to go after and chase my people on. And after a few times in that, the Army kind of realized he's not bringing anybody in. So they just surrounded Wildcat and captured him and forced him to surrender there. In fact, I might do that as a video on my blog next around July 4th, because there was a meeting with Colonel Worth and Wildcat on July 4th, 1841.
It's always good to have a July 4th special for sure.
Yeah.
Again, for those that have joined Seminole
Yeah.
War, Mr. Kimball
Yeah.
has a YouTube channel. Check it out.
Yeah.
Description down below
Yeah.
for all your books as well. Yeah, there's so many questions I want to ask, mostly about the tactics. And one thing I've run into in reading, it's hard to find these past readings, but they talk about cutting down barrels of muskets. Like Rogers Rangers does it. I've wondered if it seems like the Native Americans, they don't do that. And the Army, wouldn't think they're doing that. But did you ever run into any sort of modifications on guns or something that was like, that's interesting that they did that, or not so much?
The only time I've heard of that being done is if they were selling off old muskets or providing them for
Okay.
settlers, like the Armed Occupation Act or something like that. That's decommissioning a musket if you cut off the front where the bayonet lug is. That's how
Ah,
you decommission a musket. They're just chop
really?
it down at that point. Yeah. See, even in the 1830s, the principal arm is the bayonet. Muskets are not accurate enough, so they're considered one shot, and then it's hand to hand combat. Considered at that point until once you get into the Mexican War and of course the Civil War, where it's just all carnage.
Yeah.
But yeah, once you cut the bayonet slug off or that part, it's then it's a army surplus, I guess. Yeah.
And they're actually fighting in Florida with wool regimentals, or they do in the Revolution. Sometimes they would just do the linen undershirt, and they wouldn't have the
Yeah,
waistcoat. The waistcoat is
yeah.
that?
They had the blue wool, and then they had the cotton kind of like canvas winter or no summer uniform, which is white cotton canvas, which is no cooler than wool.
Yeah.
I've worn them both. I can tell you how it is. I've worn that cotton canvas in the summertime at Fort Morgan. It'll just soak the sweat out of you. But yeah, you could say that they were still a colder climate at that time, still
Okay.
having some major freezes, but also the summertime. There's like a recording in the Army Navy Chronicle again. They're recording temperatures at Palatka and in June over 100 degrees. So. But one thing, because of the wool and this one, whenever I'm firing my musket, I never wear synthetic fibers because you don't want to get your spark on synthetic fibers. It's not good for you. So we wear cotton or wool. So I wear wool or cotton fabrics only when I'm firing, just as a safety precaution. So back then, it's pretty much wool was partly for safety because of the volatile gunpowder.
Hmm.
In fact, there was there's been a few times where in the Army Navy Chronicle lists several accounts where some of the soldiers were, messing around with gunpowder and just seeing how much they could put in their musket or the cannon and blowing their arms off or something like that. But the wool is actually kind of a layer that protects against the gunpowder. If there's a spark that gets on the wool, pretty much it goes out at that point. It doesn't it doesn't burn through as much as
That
cotton.
would burn through
Yeah,
his, yeah, linen would
yeah,
burn through that pretty quick. It's pretty
yeah,
light. Well, I just wonder because linen is, even like I'm up in Virginia. I've done some reenactments
yeah,
down in South
mhm,
Carolina, and once you get sweating in the linen, it actually is quite cooling, right? The linen's
yeah,
not bad. Linen's not bad at
yeah.
all to
Not
work
not
in,
that. Yeah.
but the wool is just brutal.
Yeah, and in fact, anybody who does live in history, you kind of find that out from experience that even though you'll sweat all over, once the breeze starts, it'll cool you off. So,
Yeah, it's a little
yeah.
self-cooling. You have a question from Mr. From Jody.
Jody, good question. My friend Joe Kanish, who's written many books on the Florida history, the Seminole Wars, just did a talk on yellow fever during the history of Florida, covering that time period. Yes, yellow fever was prevalent early into the 20th century. In fact, there was yellow fever epidemics in the 1830s and 40s. I'm in Tallahassee, and there's a mass burial trench in the old city's graveyard where there's several hundred people buried from yellow fever. We have a governor who died of yellow fever like just a few weeks after his term ended. Yellow fever wiped out There's was it uh, Port Leon, south of Tallahassee, one of the towns there. There was St. Joseph was a town on the Gulf Coast, port city that was wiped out from yellow fever. Yeah, Captain Gabriel Rains, who I mentioned, he was sent to recuperate in New Orleans. That at the time, a yellow fever epidemic going through there, and he basically said, "What did you send me here to kill me off?" For sure. There, at that point, going from Florida to yellow fever in New Orleans. There, so yes, that was a big problem at that point, and people didn't understand at that point that was mosquito driven. They thought it was caused by vapors from the swamps, pneumatic vapors or whatever they called it. So, and of course, a lot of people were killed from that. But I mean, the Seminoles didn't necessarily have a cure for that either. When I worked at the park in Southwest Florida, I had a Miccosukee Indian village across the street, and we were ground zero for mosquitoes in the summertime. And we asked him, "What do you do about the mosquitoes?" He said, "We just leave. We go up north, up to Arcadia. That's about 100 miles north of there, where the soil is very sandy. You don't have a lot of standing water, and the mosquitoes just aren't around in that area." So yeah, they just another reason is the Seminole clothing. It's like that linen or that cotton clothing. They would cover from wrist to ankle, and that's what one part is keeping the mosquitoes off that part at least. And the women had these capes or something that they could hold and nurse their child and put the cape over it, and the child would be kind of protected like a mosquito netting or something with that cape. Just different ways of doing that there. The men, their shirt would come down to the knees, the long shirt, and if you're sitting down or in a canoe, bending your feet, it actually kind of covers. You're on your knees, it just kind of covers everything down to the ground. So there's some tricks to it. They also there's some natural remedies. There's a beauty berry, which is a particular plant. You can rub the leaves on your skin, and it kind of repels mosquito. There's dog fennel that the pollen keeps it off. So the Seminoles pretty much were well armed with rifles. And I mentioned earlier that in the Treaty of Payne's Landing in 1832, the Seminole population at the time was about 5,000, so they had about 2,000 warriors. So the Army or the U.S. government in the treaty gave the Seminoles 2,200 Derringer rifles and basically armed the whole Seminole nation for the next war at that point. Of course, they had trade rifles that they had gotten from the Spanish or the British. They'd even go to the Bahamas or Cuba and trade in that area. So the Seminoles were actually well armed. In fact, sometimes they make comments that they were better armed than the soldiers at that point. Sometimes they'd have captured arms that they'd get from the soldiers. Company of Dragoons was raided in down at where is it? It's now Charlotte Harbor, I believe. The Dragoons company was raided by the Seminoles in 1839, and about 24 killed and wounded. And the Seminoles actually took some of the Hall rifles, and one of them was captured or recaptured when he surrendered down in Tampa Bay. Later on, they said, "Hey, this is one of our Halls," and something like that. So, yeah.
And the 1814 is that's the Derringer one, because there's the 1814 and the 1817. You see the 1817s pop up decent amount, but the 1814s are very rare.
Yeah, it's more the 1817 models because the contract really didn't get going until 1818.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, that
and,
checks out.
and they tried to convert them over to percussion really quick, but it just never. No, finally in the 1840s, and then they dropped that, and then gosh, I can't remember what they were doing after that. But anyway, I have the books in my bookcase, but that's for another day.
That's interesting that they would gift
Yeah.
rifles. I guess it makes sense, right? Rifles are more beneficial for hunting, and
See the
it's a good gift.
techni-
It's a good gift.
well, the technology was improving so quickly that there was just so many rifle manufacturers, and you know, if they had older models, they just weren't selling, and the government to keep them in business was buying them out, and that was Derringer's problem. Suddenly, percussion caps were coming out, and so what does he do with all those flintlocks? Well, the government went and bought his stock out there, uh, just to try to keep him in business. And of course, it's kind of strange because they didn't pay Colt for the 500 from him for a long time, and he went bankrupt and eventually teamed up with Patterson. And of course, we know what happened after that. There, how big
Jody,
was?
actually,
Yeah,
I had this question earlier. So what Jody just said, how big was the
yeah,
Seminole population at that time? How many? So I guess we can start from the beginning and
yeah.
go, because we know how big they are at the end. They're only just a few hundred.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
A census that they took in 1822 estimated at 5,000 population in Florida, and that's about what they went for when estimated when the Second Seminole War started in 1835 is pretty stable. Um, Now it's Seminole and Miccosukee tribe together in Florida today. It's up to about 4,000. It's getting up to what the population was when the United States tried to remove them. If you can imagine, at the end of the Third Seminole War, they only estimate about 200 remaining in Florida. You know, how much space can 200 people fill? If you have was it, I don't know how many, uh, 20, God, tens of thousands of square miles of the Florida Peninsula.
Yeah.
Um, how 200 people can hide pretty good, at that point. Um, I've been, at some of the football games where you have tens of thousands of people just getting your crowd size. Yeah, it's kind of interesting where you're in the stadium uh, and there's like 5,000 people in a stadium, or 10,000, I think. Can't remember how many thousand, but there's as many people, more people in the stadium than the size of the army was at that time. Uh, if you can imagine the United States, the eastern seaboard, the southern Gulf Coast, Louisiana Purchase, Texas, Mexico border, uh, everybody was spread kind of thin, I'd imagine, at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of reinforces the whole, why are we sending down a regiment or two to hunt down people? Like, if we can't find, just how
Yeah.
massive Florida is. And was
Yeah.
Florida's main value, was it just for cattle then? That was because they don't have a large scale agricultural process, or they're not
Um,
South Carolina or Virginia or anything,
yeah,
right?
the Spanish had a big fishing industry, but then when the United States uh, was able to get Florida, it became a big source of naval stores, pine trees, turpentine,
Okay.
things like that. A big uh, and the live oak too, the live oak for the ships. The Constitution, USS Constitution, the oak came from Georgia, South Carolina, and they wanted the live oak in Florida. In fact, they're lumbering the live
Ah,
oak even when the Spanish were here. Um, so when the United States got Florida, they had an area they reserved for live oak for the ship near Pensacola. So then now that's like a national preserve. They call it Live Oak Preserve. Um, and that was one of the big industries in Florida. Yeah, cattle, fishing, live oak, turpentine, some agriculture. And, that was about it there.
Yeah, it's just so interesting how quickly the United States is expanding. It's Spain at this time is
Yeah.
collapsing in on itself, right? Like
Right.
the Mexican Revolution, which is way more
Yeah.
bloody than the American Revolution, is about to kick off. You have the gentleman down in what's his name, Venezuela and Colombia.
Yeah.
Come on, what's his name?
Uh,
Famous revolutionary. So he's tearing apart what's left of the Spanish
Bolivar.
Empire. Bolivar,
Bolivar.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
sir. Yeah, Bolivar.
Yeah.
So Spain's just at a weak spot. Hence,
Yeah.
Jackson can go down and take stuff. So it's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, there was a guy, his name was Gregor McGregor, a Scotsman, and he was a con artist. And he started his own country in Honduras and sold fake real estate for that. Well, he came to Fernandina in Florida, Northeast Florida, in 1817, and basically with his pirate friends set up a colony. And he was the timeshare real estate scam artist of the day. He say he was the king of Poyea or something, and
Nice. Florida. Go ahead.
promise these people a luxurious colony, if they pay to buy real estate. And so he had fraudulent real estate claims and titles that he sold. And of course, the United States gained Florida and chased him out of Fernandina, so he went down to Honduras. But he was involved with Boulevard, and I think he actually married one of Bolivar's family there. And he was eventually, chased out of Honduras, but he lived till like the 1840s and never really, he kind of lived off of his wealth. He married wealthy and he and off his real estate scams and got away with it basically.
Well, we have to make the Florida man joke, right? So
Yeah.
he was getting the full Florida experience. What is a turpentine scarred tree? I don't quite know it. Turpentine is a pitch?
Yeah, it's it would be for caulking wood, turpentine, of course, sticky sap, and then they boil it and turn it into like mineral spirits, kerosene. But the tree to get it out, first they would chop a wedge in the tree, and they'd put like a little bowl underneath it and catch the rosin. Then they started scratching scars in it, and they called them cat face. And it's like this V-shaped scratch on the tree, and they'd scratch away the bark, and it pour down into a cup or a basin at the bottom of the scratch, and they'd scratch it some more, so you'd have this V-shaped uh, uh, scratch on the tree going all the way up with the bark scratched away. And that was a big industry up through World War II.
Hmm.
Uh, they had whole company towns off of turpentine and lumber in Florida uh, from the early 1800s up through the 1940s.
Well, I never knew that. I didn't knew
Yeah,
Florida was
yeah,
a resource heavy state. I
yeah,
always wondered because you hear about St. Augustine, right? That's been around forever.
yeah.
And that's a place for the Spanish to put in before, just like a safe harbor. But the rest of Florida is very minus it's basically, is it just St. Augustine and Pensacola? Is there really any other cities?
Yeah, there was Key West down on the islands, and pretty much these were just port cities, just protecting the Spanish interests. The Spanish fleet coming up from South America and Cuba, just keeping an outpost on that and keeping a footprint. But the Spanish never made Florida economically feasible. Was their white elephant, and they never made it profitable for them. Uh, in fact, the government changed when Napoleon took over Spain and overthrew the Spanish crown. The government changed on paper in St. Augustine, but was the same people because they just amended their charter, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Well, we only have 35 minutes more of this live stream. This is my first time running the live stream. I have a limit of 2 hours. If it works out, I'll spend the money to get more. Also get more comfortable having these. One question I really want to kind of bring it back to is swamp battles. What is the largest battle of the Seminole War? And if we can just, you had talked about the 90 soldiers that were killed in the earlier defeat. If you have another one that you would like to talk about, or one that really stands out, that I think that'd be really that really ties it all in together.
Yeah. In late 1837, General Jessup, he was a quartermaster, so he knew supplies, and he developed a campaign to drive the Indians out of South Florida in these big, huge commands that would spread out. So he had his central column under Zachary Taylor, later President Zachary Taylor, with the 1st Infantry. Taylor was the central column. He headed south and met the Seminoles, kind of the second largest battle on the shore of Lake Okeechobee on Christmas Day, 1837. That involved 800 of Taylor's soldiers, which included Missouri militia, 1st and 6th Infantry, and one other infantry regiment, maybe 4th Infantry. 6th Infantry got really shot up bad. In fact, they lost most all their officers.
This is 1837, you said?
1837, Christmas Day, 1837, Battle of Okeechobee. The regimental commander was Alexander Thompson, was killed in the battle. You have your regimental colonel killed in the battle there.
Wow.
He was the highest ranking officer killed in the war. At the same time, General Jessup, he was coming down the East Coast, and they established Fort Pierce. And so this was early January. This is about 3 weeks after the Battle of Okeechobee. They sent a kind of a joint command, Army Navy, up the Waxahachie River, searching for Seminoles, looking for villages. They basically got in ambush and nearly wiped out at that point, but were saved from one of the artillerymen who got a hold of a howitzer and started firing at the Seminoles and forced them back. A man named Joseph Johnston, who would be a Confederate officer in the Civil War. And so they made it back. I can't remember the number, is like 40 or something soldiers. There was a Seminole village of maybe as much as 500 up in that area. So General Jessup brought his whole command up the Waxahachie River, 2nd Dragoons, Tennessee Volunteers, regular militia, numbering about 1,600 soldiers. And that was the largest battle, and that was the Battle of Waxahachie on January 24th, 1838. Now there's it's like Battle Riverside Park, off of Indiantown Road in Palm Beach County, where they commemorate that. In fact, we had 2 years ago, I believe it was, we had a commemoration at the battle site with the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Seminole Nation in Oklahoma met kind of for the first time as an official battle commemoration ceremony. So that was quite, and they pretty much lost track of where the battle was for 150 years. Even the Battle of Okeechobee was after the Army left, nobody was left there, so they kind of forgot where it was at. Just through research and archaeology work and people with metal detectors finding grape shot and musket balls and trying to figure out what it was through, and archaeology work in the late 1990s determined the location of the battlefield. And so that one was saved, and it found that was at the location of a county park. The Battle of Okeechobee was discovered. The location was discovered in the 1980s, and it became a state park in 2007. There's not much at Battle of Okeechobee. The state has the property. You can go there. Maybe just an interpretive kiosk, but really nothing much there to see. The Battle of Waxahachie, they actually have programs, tours of the battle site on Saturday. I think Saturday at 10 o'clock at the battle site, and take you around to tell you about some of the things that happened there.
I'm looking at some of the pictures on at least the Wikipedia page. So it's the terrain is kind of what I'm interested in.
Yes.
I live in Jacksonville, like I had mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And the pine trees with that shrub that comes up to basically waist high, not shrub, like the bushes.
Yeah, the palmettos. Yeah.
The palmettos. Okay. So they're fighting through terrain like that.
Yeah.
They're fighting because there's like real swamps, like, southeast Georgia that you run into.
Yeah.
But it seems like mostly on the same sort of place that you would have cattle roam is what you would be fighting on with hardened ground.
Yeah. Now going back to the Seminole dress that they were wearing, it was cotton calico, a lot of different patterns and colors. And you'd think that'd stick out in the woods, but you get in the background like you see on the virtual background like me, and it actually disappears because it breaks a pattern. It's just a non-consistent pattern. It doesn't matter what color it is. You step back in the woods and it disappears. And in fact, people complain at some of our battle reenactments that they can't see the Seminoles. And of course, that's the whole purpose. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you're doing a good job with the reenactment, right?
Yeah.
And but you mentioned that, well, the two things. One thing was the Missouri militia, all the way down from Missouri, was down there to fight the Seminoles. That is a long way. And this
they had a company of Germans from Philadelphia. And a lot of those, the reason why they're in Florida, they bring them there as a bet. It's like, I bet I could bring this country as a company of settlers, and they'd take care of things. And how the Missouri militia got in there was that Thomas Hart Benton and Martin Van Buren were having a talk about the war in Congress, and Martin Van Buren was saying, gee, it's kind of nice how Missouri's, free of all those Indians. And he said, yeah, I bet the Missouri militia could take care of the Seminoles. So they raised up the few companies of Missouri militia and sent them down, and a lot of them got killed at the Battle of Okeechobee. They didn't do so well.
Yeah. There. Well, you mentioned, and the other part was the 6th Infantry Regiment.
Right.
So I'm originally from Iowa, and the Black Hawk War happens in 1832, and I want to do like a little bit of research in the Black Hawk War, but the 6th Infantry Regiment is at the Black Hawk War.
Okay.
The entire regiment. So that means they're up in Rock Island, Illinois. They go up to Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Another interesting part about them is that they're actually armed with Hall rifles. Just the infantry. There's companies in the infantry regiment armed with the model of 1819.
Yeah.
So I wonder. So that just makes me wonder if they actually went down to Florida with Hall rifles, or just kind of more about the 6th Infantry. I'll have to look into that, because you mentioned the Hall rifle that was recovered out of the swamp was a carbine. You're pretty sure?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's probably a dragoon gun.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that was That was actually in the Withlacoochee River at the spot that we determined where Izzard was shot in the head while he was down at the river there. So it's pretty well accepted. That's what it was.
Is the Navy and the Marines, are they raiding along the coasts? Are they doing kind of like a brown water Navy, down the St. John's? Sounds like we've talked a lot about the Army component, and then the Marines are kind of going ashore. They're leading that
Yeah.
native regiment.
Yeah. Yeah. A little bit of that. And in fact, the Marine Corps at that time only had 40 officers. It wasn't very large. What the Jessup did is agreement with the Marine Corps Commandant, Archibald Henderson. He actually came down into Florida, and he was at the I think he might have been at the Battle of Waxahachie. He was at another battle, Hatchalustee Creek. He just wanted to get his gunpowder fired off, right? And he just didn't want to miss out on the party. So that said that he left a sign on his office in Washington, gone down to Florida. And the Army would try to send as much of its soldiers, garrison soldiers, out into the field, didn't want them in the fort. And the Marine Corps actually took part of garrisoning the field, the forts, at least on the Fort King Road and along the coast, Fort Foster, Fort Dade. You have records of the Marine Corps filling the positions in the forts there. And of course, you had the Marine Corps that was with the Creek Regiment. And the Marine Corps took large part in a battle called the Battle of Hatchalustee Creek. And that's January 1837. Yeah. That was a year before the Battle of Waxahachie there. Almost a year to the day.
No, it sounds like just an insurgency operation that kind of mimics of what we had like in Iraq and Afghanistan, a small outpost. Because the one outpost you talked about that got in a gunfight, they had only 18 men. So just outposts. And do we know if what's the smallest amount of men they would send out on patrol? Because I'm assuming they're going on patrol to gather food, kindling, the patrolling aspect of warfare of this time period.
That would be up and down during the war. I mentioned Miss Montgomery that got killed, and buried in Cincinnati. She was with a command of about a dozen soldiers, just going between Micanopy and Wakahuta, and so then one of the big scandals of that is that there was not enough soldiers. That the Secretary of War said, or had to be at least 30 infantry soldiers to a scout. Now the problem is that they were short. They couldn't always field 30. They were lucky if they could, have a company of 30 men at that point. Just the shortages going around. And so that was a problem. Then they had a proposal in 1841 that General Armistead, Walker Armistead, wanted to send out little scouting missions of one officer and 3 soldiers, and not stay along the road, but kind of scout between posts and between forts, and just avoid direct contact, but just try to find the Indians that way. So, they're experimenting a lot. And it turns out usually the ones that get in fights and skirmishes are the small number, the of less than 40 that get into the real hand-to-hand combat.
I'll just close out on the one thing that's interesting about the Indian Wars. It seems like there's so many small unit actions that are never written about. We don't know. They'll kind of, a paragraph will cover, there's patrols going out and they're getting in fights, and that stuff's always interesting, because I think with the modern context, I look at a battle and like, oh, there's only a couple hundred on each side, and when you compare that to other historical battles, you kind of, for at least me, I kind of I kind of loop.
Yes.
I guess what I say is it's more interesting to think about the smaller actions that are going out, the guys that are living out there and like operating day by day in what would become the United States state of Florida. But I'll let you basically finish out the time with Slippy Snick, or anyone else who has any questions, just post them up.
Yeah, that's a big subject because there's been books written about the African Americans or the Black Seminoles, or however you category. When the British left Florida, they had freed all their slaves. The British, when they evacuate the area, they didn't always take everyone with them there, which we can see from New Orleans. The British left a lot of people in the Bahamas. And so the Seminoles had a lot of black allies who settled alongside them in Florida. And they became, of course, warriors. The population of what we call the Black Seminoles is 800 to 1,000, maybe as much as that in Florida. Of course, when the issue of removing General Jessup, in order to get rid of the Seminoles who didn't want to leave without their black allies, Jessup was telling the black allies basically that they could be free if they went out to Oklahoma. So the incentive of the Indian trying to fight to stay in Florida, but the black Seminole wanted to get away from slavery where they're not a target of slave hunters. So the West kind of appealed to him at that point. So I think that might have been both Jessup's part to get the Seminoles to remove as quick as he could, but also to put a wedge between allies because the Black Seminoles are wanting to remove quicker. But yeah, that's a very complicated subject too. We've done whole seminars on that subject at that point on what they did and where they were at in different towns, from what they called Negro Fort, which I mentioned, blown up by the Army in the First Seminole War, or by the boat coming up the Apalachicola River. And of course, it's tied in because the Second Seminole War, you had the Army having the ugly job of fugitive slave rounding up. It's kind of interesting because the slaves on the plantation were actually working covertly with some of the Seminole warriors, like Wildcat. There's a plantation outside of St. Augustine, and the slaves were basically left alone. And they were actually giving intelligence to the Seminoles on, when the Army might be moving around or something like that, which is, another interesting thing there. Have stories on that too. We could do another program on that sometime there.
Yeah, if anyone else has any questions, we'll have to do it again. I mean, this is super interesting. Like I said, I'm trying to think of more the attack. So we talked about what they wore on both sides. We talked about their weapons. We talked about some of the battles. Talked about some of the tactics, the strategy. The strategy overall was to at first push them back and then remove them. So the first Seminole Wars, just get them out of there, like get them away from the white settlers or the American settlers, I guess.
Kind of punish them for, keep them out of Georgia and all that. Yes. And then Second and Third Seminole War was just straight up Indian removal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, anyone else have any post away?
Okay. Hopefully we didn't bore everyone.
Hey, for first live stream where I didn't even announce that we were going to do it, just threw it up there. We got up to like 13 people. So
pretty good. Yeah.
No, it's all about, learning, like, because you had dropped a comment and we were talking, you had commented about tactics, right? Or like engagement, like the line of battle. Yeah. So there's so much history. I was just out at Martin's Station, amazing spot, and talking to a living historian out there. I invited him to come on sometime to talk about just warfare in Western Virginia against the native tribes there, and how it was different.
Have you been to Fort
Pistols and
Meigs?
swords.
Yeah, have you
Fort
been?
Meigs? No, I don't think so.
There was the War of 1812. You have the River Raisin, and there was at Fort Meigs, they call it Dudley's Downfall, where the Kentucky militia was going up to rescue the fort from being under siege by the Indian allies in Tecumseh, and they basically got wiped out because they went chasing after the Indians, and the Indians basically surrounded them and captured them. It started killing them until the British officer arrived and said, "Wait, let's not kill all the Americans." And I actually had an ancestor who survived that there. So that's interesting.
Well, with the last 10 minutes, Chris, if you just want to tell us about yourself, about the books you've written, take this time to. You have a YouTube channel, Seminole War, so everyone, please go subscribe to that. Check his channel out. And Chris, we were talking about your history of before we started the live stream. So
I've written 3 books. I kind of did it for myself, for the history, to get the information out there. I started out with Seminole and Creek War battles and events, and there's a website, I think it's bookshop.org or something. If you could put just in the link in the description of the video.
I got it
on YouTube. And then I'm building up my own reference library. I went through the Army Navy Chronicle, and sorry about the glare, but this is Army and Navy Chronicle, Seminole War Guide, where I took all the Seminole War references and indexed them to kind of a brief synopsis. And you can go on Hathi Trust or Google Books and look up the actual journal and read over 6,000 pages of the Army Navy Chronicle, kind of know where the articles are at. And then I wrote Alachua Ambush, which is the latter part of the war. This is like about 1840, some of the major battles that happened around Micanopy. I wanted to write about something that nobody else has written about. They all write about the beginning of the war, and then everybody kind of gives up after that and doesn't really write how it finished. So I cover some of the main battles that happened around Micanopy in 1840. There. So anyway.
Yeah, because you started in 1985, because you're prior Army, right?
Yeah, I was. I got out of college. I was doing the Seminole War reenactments interpretation. I went in the Army, spent 5 years in the Army, went to Germany, Fort Huachuca, where I got pictures in my Seminole garb and the most un-Florida type backgrounds there. And came back to Florida. I was with the Florida Park Service for 10 years. Before that, I worked at Fort Morgan, Alabama. Been a black powder safety supervisor, and developed the safety historic weapons program for the Florida Park System. So I can go down any rabbit hole we want, there.
Well, just in closing, I guess, why is the Seminole War important, and also what is overlooked about it in American history? We kind of talked about that time frame of post 1812 to the Mexican-American War, but what stuck out? Well, sounds like you're from the area, but what stood out to you about the Seminole Wars, and why is it important to American history, if you could answer that?
I think it's kind of the training for the future. The United States, it's going to be a world power, and they kind of developed their diplomatic relations from first trying to be diplomatic with the Native Americans, which doesn't work out so well. It's also becomes training ground for the Army, going from a Napoleonic type warfare to modern warfare. You have quick changing technology. You use the flintlock musket for 100 years, and all of a sudden you got percussion cap. You have different artillery methods developing in the Civil War that make the brick fortifications obsolete. And another thing during the 1830s is that West Point developed training for the officers. He went from officers would just be somebody who had a lot of money and needed a job to actually a intelligently trained officer who was good at surveying and artillery tactics and infantry tactics. You find out, with the advanced weapons, you really need smart people to be engineers and to survey. But of course, a lot of these engineers, they become builders of the railroads and develop the countries and roads and urban development from that. So is really the military academy was a technical school first, engineering school, which of course came into a lot of industries from there. The United States was trying to be an army different from the European army. Is that, with the British Army and all that, we want a trained army. The United States wanted to be an army more of everyone involved. The soldier was not just a peasant who was thrown in there. We want to be a volunteer army of people who would defend the home front. So trying to actually develop a concept different from Napoleonic warfare, which of course led to the Mexican War and the Civil War, and of course you have all the political issues that went into the mix as well.
A story for another day.
Yeah, right.
Well, if we have no more questions, we'll close it before they close it on me. So
okay.
Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you,
Mr. Kimball. And we'll have to do this again. And thanks for your time again. Check out your channel, check out all your books, and really appreciate it. I'll close the stream.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Yep. Okay.